Welcome to the Playing Books podcast. Today we are undertaking, well, a truly comprehensive deep dive, I think, into one of history's most confounding and spectacular figures, Alexander of Macedon. And we're using what many consider the definitive critical biography, Peter Green's Alexander of Macedon, 356-323 BC.
Yeah, this book it's pretty much mandatory reading if you're serious about Alexander. And the reason really is the author himself, Peter Green. He is not just a top-tier classicist. He was also this incredibly relentless critic and journalist.
Right, I remember reading about his capacity.
Yeah.
Wasn't there that story about him reviewing like 25 books on ancient Egypt all at once?
Exactly. That's the kind of mind we're dealing with. Just this vast ability to consume and synthesize material. And that dual perspective, the meticulous scholar, combined with the almost ruthless journalist, means this biography just refuses to romanticize Alexander.
Which is exactly what we want to do today. Our mission here is to cut through centuries of legend, really. We're examining Alexander's whole career, right from the volatile, highly political circumstances of his birth, straight through to the deeply mysterious circumstances surrounding his death.
And looking for practical lessons, that's key. Lessons for you, the listener, in ambition, leadership, and, well, the inevitable price of absolute power.
Absolutely. Green doesn't pull any punches. He lays out his central verdict right from the start, and it's the lens for everything.
Yeah, he says Alexander was undeniably the most brilliant, and you have to add ambitious, field commander in history. Full stop. But, and this is the critical part, Green insists, and backs it up meticulously, that Alexander was also supremely indifferent to all those administrative excellences and idealistic yearnings foisted upon him by later generations.
No philosopher king spreading enlightenment here, according to Green.
Not in the way later ages imagined him. We're diving into the documented facts. And, maybe more importantly, Green's critical interpretation, which always tries to avoid, as he puts it, the transient fashions of modern research.
Okay, so if we're stripping away the myths, let's start right at the beginning, the foundations of this incredible ambition. Back in 356 BC.
Well, Alexander's arrival, according to the sources anyway, was just framed by sheer drama and superstition. His birth supposedly coincided with these three, overwhelming strokes of good fortune for his father, Philip II, all hitting in quick succession.
Right, there's a big military victory by his top general, Parmenio.
Yep, Parmenio's victory. Then a really high-profile win in the Olympic horse race, which was huge PR back then.
And then Alexander's birth. 3 massive wins.
Exactly, and Philip's reaction. It wasn't pure joy. Apparently, he panicked.
Which is just... It's so revealing of that ancient mindset, isn't it? Here's arguably the most powerful man in the age, and he's reportedly begging Fortune, the goddess, for a small setback.
Yeah, begging for a little bit of bad luck, because he feared that pileup of good fortune meant the gods were setting him up for a fall, like Polycrates of Samos, that famous tyrant cursed by his own luck.
He thought it was too good to be true. So how did he commemorate these huge events?
Very selectively and politically. Of those 3 big wins, the only one he chose to really publicly immortalize was the Olympic victory. He issued a new series of silver coins, showed Zeus on one side and this spirited winning horse on the other. It was pure image crafting, kingly power, athletic prowess.
You really have to picture the world he was born into, though. Early Macedonia. Green paints this picture of a pretty primitive state compared to Athens or Corinth.
Oh, absolutely. Constant baronial intrigue. The Macedonian court wasn't about philosophical debates. It was rife with endemic, as Green puts it, bloody murder and usurpation. Life was cheap.
And some of their customs, they sound almost barbaric.
Totally. Think about how they purified the army before a campaign. It involved a priest cutting a dog clean in half.
Wait, cutting it in half?
Clean in half. And the entire army then had to march between the 2 severed halves. That's the kind of visceral, ruthless world Alexander grew up in. Power was raw.
And his father, Philip II, was the ultimate product of that environment, wasn't he?
Definitely. Physically imposing, strong, sensual, heavily bearded, known addict to drink, women, and boys. His whole approach to leadership was cynical pragmatism. He had this genial contempt, Green calls it, for all human pretensions to virtue or idealism.
He's the one with the famous quote, right, that no city was impregnable.
If it had an ass laden with gold that could get inside, yeah. He saw everything, everyone, as having a price. Very transactional.
Which makes his relationship with Olympias, Alexander's mother, even more interesting. She's often painted as this jealous wife.
And Green just demolishes that modern romantic legend. Yes, she was fierce, definitely murderous when necessary. But Green argues her driving force wasn't jealousy over Philip's other women. It was all about kinship loyalties. Her absolute focus was preserving her son's dynastic position, her bloodline on the throne.
So if we're not looking at it through a simplistic Freudian lens, like an Oedipus complex, how does Green frame Alexander's relationship with his parents?
It's complex, naturally. He clearly idolized Olympias, who absolutely fueled his dynastic ambition, no question. But the relationship with Philip. Green describes it as an ambivalent blend of genuine admiration and underlying competitiveness. He admired his father's strength and success, but he also knew he had to surpass him.
And that competitiveness, that drive for status, seems key.
That's the crucial thing Green emphasizes. Forget the deep psychological baggage for a moment. Alexander's one overriding obsession from childhood was his future status as king. There's a story where young Alexander criticized Philip for having kids with other women, and Philip's retort wasn't comforting, it was a challenge. He basically said, look, if you have rivals, then prove yourself worthy. Earn the kingdom through your own merits, not just because you're my son.
Wow. Talk about pressure from a young age. That ambition was clearly there early on.
You see it in that special knowingness. Green talks about the way kids of major public figures are often years ahead in understanding power dynamics. Like when he was only 7 years old, grilling those Persian envoys who visited Philip's court.
Right, he wasn't asking about the hanging gardens or, tourist stuff.
No, he was asking about troop numbers, the state of the roads to the Persian capital Susa, the morale of the Persian army. He was thinking strategically at age 7. It's incredible.
And then, to shape this intellect, Philip brings in the big gun. Aristotle.
Yeah, assigns Aristotle to teach Alexander and his companions at this place called the Precinct of the Nymphs at Mieza. And Philip's instruction to Aristotle is fascinating. He supposedly said, teach him so that you may not do a great many things of the sort that I am sorry to have done.
So Philip recognized his own flaws, the drinking, the ruthlessness maybe, and hoped philosophy could temper them in his son.
Seems like it. An attempt to instill some kind of, philosophical grounding, but Alexander learned practical lessons just as much, if not more.
The famous incense anecdote. This one really sticks with you.
It's brilliant. His tutor, Leonidas, sees young Alexander being really lavish with incense during a sacrifice. He rebukes him, basically saying, hey kid, you can waste incense like that after you've conquered the lands where spices come from. A sharp lesson about resource management versus spending.
A bit harsh, maybe.
Definitely cutting. But years later, fast forward, Alexander conquers Gaza, which happens to be the main spice trading hub for the whole region.
And he remembers Leonidas's comment.
Oh, he remembers. He arranges for 18 tons of frankincense and myrrh to be shipped back to the now old man, Leonidas, enough to make him incredibly wealthy. And the message that came with it basically told Leonidas to stop being stingy with the gods.
18 tons. It's such a power move, a spectacular, almost theatrical way of saying, lesson learned. And by the way, I now control resources beyond your imagination.
The ultimate I told you so, but on a geopolitical scale. It's a fantastic practical application of a lesson learned.
But Aristotle's influence wasn't just practical tips in philosophy, right? There was a darker side to his advice, politically speaking.
Yeah, Green really emphasizes the ethnocentric counsel Aristotle gave him. Basically, he advised Alexander to be a hegemon, a leader to the Greeks, but a despot, an absolute ruler to the barbarians.
Treat Greeks like friends and relatives.
And treat non-Greeks as with beasts or plants. That's the quote.
Wow. That essentially gives him a license for a dual morality, doesn't it?
Completely. Be one kind of ruler to us and a totally different, harsher ruler to them. This laid the ideological groundwork, Green argues, for the massive cultural clashes and political dilemmas Alexander would face throughout the entire Asian expedition.
Okay, so Alexander inherits this incredible military machine, largely thanks to Philip's genius.
Philip really revolutionized Macedonian warfare. He scorned the old Greek tradition of only campaigning in good weather in the summer season. He pushed for relentless, year-round, long-term strategy, and the core of it was the Macedonian phalanx.
Centered around that monster spear, the sarissa.
Yeah, we really need to picture this thing. 13 to 14 feet long. Imagine rows and rows of soldiers holding these. When they formed up, the first 5 ranks could all project their spear points beyond the front line. It created this unbelievable wall of sharp steel, just bristling. It completely broke traditional Greek hoplite tactics.
And this machine reaches its peak at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC. Huge victory over the Greek city-states.
Massive. And Alexander, who's only 18 at this point, he's leading the crucial cavalry charge, the companion cavalry, that breaks the enemy line. He gets a lot of glory.
And Philip's celebration. Typical Philip, apparently.
Oh, yeah. Gets completely drunk, starts insulting the Athenian prisoners, mocking them. But then in this weird flash of something else, he supposedly wept when he saw the annihilation of the Sacred Band of Thebes, this elite unit that fought to the last man.
That contradiction again. The brilliant strategist, the drunken boor, the moment of insight.
Exactly. That mix was Philip. But the celebration didn't last long because the dynastic crisis was already brewing. And Green stresses this wasn't just a family spat.
This was pure politics. Philip repudiates Olympias.
Effectively divorces her, pushes her aside, and marries Cleopatra, who, crucially, was a high-ranking Macedonian aristocrat, unlike Olympias, who was from Epirus.
And the motive here was clear.
Crystal clear, according to Green. Philip wanted a new male heir who was 100% Macedonian on both sides. This was a direct threat to Alexander's position, an attempt to sideline him and his mother's Epirote influence. A political earthquake aimed at Alexander's long-matured intentions to succeed his father.
And it all blows up at the wedding feast.
Predictably, lots of wine flowing. Cleopatra's uncle, a powerful noble named Attalus, gets drunk and stands up to give a toast. And he toasts for the marriage to produce a legitimate successor to the kingdom.
Oof. Calling Alexander illegitimate right to his face.
Pretty much. Alexander, furious, throws his drinking cup at Attalus. Shouting breaks out. Philip, also drunk, draws his sword and tries to lunge at Alexander.
His own son.
Yeah, but he's so drunk he stumbles and falls flat on his face.
That image.
He.
The king trying to kill his son but falling down drunk. What a moment.
Alexander supposedly mocked him. Look, men, he's preparing to cross from Europe to Asia, and he can't even cross from one couch to another. And then he storms out.
And flees with Olympias.
Yep. First to her homeland, Epirus, then Alexander goes on to Illyria. And Green's take is important here. They weren't just sulking in exile. He suggests both mother and son were actively plotting against Philip, stirring up trouble on Macedonia's western borders. This wasn't just a family feud anymore, it was open political maneuvering, potentially rebellion, for the throne.
Which brings us to the climax.
Right.
336 BC, the assassination of Philip.
Right. At the wedding of Philip's own daughter, Cleopatra, to Alexander's uncle, Alexander of Epirus, a huge public event, Philip is walking into the theater, and he's stabbed by one of his own bodyguards, Pausanias.
Now, the immediate motive always cited as personal, right? Homosexual jealousy, revenge for some assault Pausanias suffered.
That seems to be the trend, yes. Pausanias definitely had a personal grudge, but Green argues this personal motive was cleverly harnessed to political ends. Someone likely manipulated Pausanias, knowing he was unstable and had a reason to strike.
The timing was just too perfect. And the aftermath. A storm of suspicion.
Immediately, propaganda starts flying, both supporting Alexander and accusing him and Olympias. Green highlights Olympias' actions as particularly telling. She returns from exile, finds Pausanias' dead body, he was killed while trying to escape, and has it displayed, crucified, and then later cremated with honors, even crowning the corpse with gold.
Not exactly the actions of someone grieving Philip or condemning this killer. It looks like she's rewarding him posthumously.
It certainly suggests a lack of remorse, at the very least, maybe even complicity. Alexander's position is trickier. He executed some immediate suspects, but not others. Green speculates, interestingly, that maybe the only reason Alexander showed any leniency towards his father's memory, any grief, was genuine personal affection, which, Green adds, arguably cost him his throne and his life because it didn't quash all suspicion.
So the question lingers. Was Alexander in on it? We still don't know for sure.
We don't, and Green loves that ambiguity. Was the son involved in murdering the father who, just months before, had tried to kill him while drunk? It's one of those great, tantalizing what-ifs of history.
Okay, so Philip's dead. Alexander is king. And he doesn't waste any time consolidating power.
No, he demonstrates this chilling, immediate, brutal efficiency. Potential rivals are eliminated fast. This includes another noble named Alexander from Lyncestis, and even his own cousin Amyntas, who technically had a strong claim to the throne himself. Ruthless.
But the biggest internal challenge wasn't necessarily those rivals, was it? It was securing the old guard, specifically Parmenio.
Exactly. Parmenio was Philip's most experienced and respected general. Alexander absolutely needed him and his network of officers for the planned invasion of Asia. Parmenio's support was non-negotiable.
And there was a price for that support.
A dark one. A very dark one. The price of Parmenio's crucial allegiance was the quiet liquidation of Attalus. Remember him? Cleopatra's uncle, the one who insulted Alexander at the wedding feast? Attalus was commanding troops in Asia Minor at the time. He was promptly murdered, and Green is clear it was done with Parmenio's connivance, if not direct involvement.
So a political bargain sealed in blood, basically, cementing this powerful clique around Parmenio that Alexander relied on.
But Green suggests probably never fully trusted. It planted seeds of future conflict right there at the start.
Okay, throne secured, key general on board. Now Alexander has to deal with the Greek cities, who were restless now Philip is gone.
Yeah, some thought they could break free, Thebes especially. Alexander initially forces their submission with a show of force, but then while he's campaigning way up north against the Triballians, rumors spread, possibly fueled by the Athenian orator Demosthenes, that Alexander himself has been killed in battle.
And Thebes seizes the opportunity to revolt again.
They do, big mistake. Alexander hears about it, force marches his army south at incredible speed, and appears before their walls. His response this time is utterly terrifying.
The destruction of Thebes, 335 BC. This is infamous.
It's brutal, total annihilation. Green says 6,000 Thebans were slaughtered in the attack. Another 30,000 were sold into slavery. And the city itself, razed to the ground, completely destroyed, except supposedly for the house of the poet Pindar, whom Alexander admired.
And adding insult to injury, some of the destruction was carried out by Thebes' old enemies, right?
Yeah.
Other Greek cities.
Green notes the Thespians and Plataeans, neighbors who had long-standing grudges against Thebes, eagerly joined in the sack. Alexander let them have their revenge.
Now, you mentioned earlier that Green calls this one of Alexander's worst psychological errors. Why? It seems like it worked. In terms of instilling fear?
Oh, it instilled fear, all right. Absolute terror. But that was the problem. It achieved immediate, cowed compliance, yes. But Green argues it was disastrous long-term. It cemented this deep-seated hatred and resentment among the Greeks. From then on, any city that submitted did so out of pure fear, not loyalty or belief in his cause. It created what Green calls cynical obsequiousness. They bowed, but they hated him.
So it undermined his whole narrative later of being the leader of a pan-Hellenic crusade against Persia.
Exactly. How can you be the liberator of the Greeks when you've just obliterated one of the most ancient and famous Greek cities? It fundamentally compromised that entire justification for the war.
It's fascinating, a show of absolute force that was maybe too absolute for his own political goals. And despite projecting this image of overwhelming power, the reality financially was pretty shaky, wasn't it?
Incredibly shaky. When Alexander finally set sail for Asia in 334 BC, launching this massive invasion, Green points out he was perilously short of ready cash. He supposedly only had about 70 talents in the treasury and enough supplies for maybe 30 days.
That's nothing for an invasion force of that size.
It's basically bankrupt. He had to borrow heavily from his own officers, his companions. Some of them gave him outright gifts, basically fronting him the money.
Why would they do that?
Because they were absolutely convinced they were about to conquer the Persian Empire and share in Darius's legendary wealth. They were betting on a quick, decisive victory and unimaginable riches.
So the entire expedition was launched on a shoestring budget and a massive gamble. High stakes doesn't even begin to cover it.
It really was. Bet the kingdom, literally, on winning that first battle. And this kind of high-wire act, this desperation maybe, sets the stage for that very famous encounter in Corinth.
Ah, yes. With Diogenes the Cynic, the philosopher living in a barrel or tub.
Right. Alexander, now the confirmed leader of the Greeks, visits Corinth. He approaches Diogenes, this counterculture icon living in deliberate poverty, and asks if there's anything he, the great Alexander, can do for him.
And Diogenes' classic reply.
Stand aside, you're keeping the sun off me. Just total dismissal of power, wealth, status.
How did Alexander react? Wasn't he insulted?
Apparently not. According to the story, he was actually impressed. He turned to his companions and said, "If I were not Alexander, I would be Diogenes."
What does Green make of that? What's the connection between the world conqueror and the renunciate philosopher?
Green sees a shared quality, which he calls stubborn and alienated intransigence. Both men were profoundly outside the norms of society, completely uncompromising in their chosen paths. Diogenes chose total withdrawal, finding freedom and having nothing and needing nothing. Alexander chose total subjugation of the world, finding power, maybe freedom of a different kind, through absolute force.
Two sides of the same coin in a way, both rejecting the ordinary world just in opposite directions.
That's a good way to put it. Both fundamentally alienated, both driven by an extreme vision. Maybe Alexander recognized a fellow traveler on a radically different path.
Okay, so Alexander crosses into Asia. The invasion begins. And it's initially presented under this banner of
The Panhellenic camouflage, as Green calls it. He lands, sets up altars to the Greek gods, makes sacrifices, prays that these territories might accept him as king of their own free will. The official justification, loudly proclaimed, was that this was a crusade of revenge for Persia's past invasions of Greece, the burning of Athens, all that. A war for Greek honor.
But you mentioned Green is cynical about this. How quickly did Alexander start acting less like a liberator and more like a new overlord?
Almost immediately. His actual administration on the ground was pure pragmatism. Sure, he'd sometimes replace the pro-Persian oligarchies in Greek cities with more democratic governments, which played well back home. But fundamentally, he took over the existing Persian administrative structure almost entirely intact.
So he kept the satraps, the regional governors.
Often, yes, or appointed his own Macedonians to those posts. And the tribute, the taxes the Persians collected, that continued too, just cleverly renamed a contribution to the war effort. He basically just swapped out the guy at the very top, Darius, with himself. It confirms Green's view that the idealistic crusade stuff was largely window dressing.
And we see that cynicism pretty clearly after the first major battle, right? At the Granicus River?
Yeah, the treatment of the Greek mercenaries fighting for the Persians. There were thousands of them, professionals, fighting for whoever paid. After Alexander won the battle, he had about 2,000 of these Greek survivors rounded up and sent back to Macedonia in chains, condemned to hard labor.
What was the justification for that? They were Greeks, technically.
The official reason was that they had violated Greek public opinion by fighting with Orientals against Greeks. He used the authority of the League of Corinth, the alliance he headed. But Green sees this as pure hypocrisy. Alexander was essentially using the idea of the League as a blanket excuse, he says, for a good many underhand actions, punishing mercenaries who were just doing their job because it suited his propaganda narrative.
Okay, let's talk about the Granicus battle itself. May 334 BC. It wasn't a foregone conclusion, was it? Parmenio had advised caution.
He did. The Persians were holding the high ground on the opposite bank of the river. It was a strong defensive position. Plus, it was the Macedonian month of Disios, apparently a time when campaigning was traditionally considered taboo, maybe connected to the harvest.
But Alexander wasn't having any of it.
No way. He couldn't afford to wait. Remember that financial pressure? Supplies and cash were running out fast. He needed a quick, decisive win now. As for the taboo month, Alexander just used his absolute authority. He made an ad hoc intercalation to the calendar, basically decreed on the spot that this month wasn't Disios, it was a second Artemisios. Problem solved.
He just changed the calendar.
Just like that. The message was clear. My will, my needs, override tradition, superstition, even the calendar itself. It had to be now or never.
And the battle itself was incredibly dangerous for him personally.
Hugely dangerous. It devolved into this chaotic, almost Homeric melee right in the riverbed. Alexander was right in the thick of it. His spear broke. He had to grab another from a companion. Then he took this massive hit from a Persian noble's saber, a kopis, that Green says sheared clean through his winged helmet, knocked him reeling.
He nearly died right there at the very start.
Almost certainly. He was about to be finished off when another officer, Black Cletus, remember that name, managed to charge in and literally cut off the attacker's arm just in the nip of time. Saved his life.
Wow, that kind of personal risk-taking. It must have electrified his men, but it's also incredibly reckless.
It defined his leadership style early on, leading from the front, sharing the danger. But yeah, one unlucky blow and the whole expedition ends right there.
Okay, so he survives Granicus, pushes on, but then about a year later, in Tarsus, he faces a different kind of threat.
Yes, the suspenseful illness at Tarsus, 333 BC. After maybe swimming in the freezing Cydnus River, he falls violently ill. High fever, possibly pneumonia, he's near death.
And the doctors are scared to treat him.
Terrified, because Darius, the Persian king, had put a massive bounty on Alexander's head, 1,000 talents, an astronomical sum. Any physician whose treatment failed, even if they did their best, risked being accused of taking Darius's bribe and deliberately poisoning the king. So nobody wanted to touch him.
Except one doctor, Philip of Acarnania.
Right, Alexander's personal, confidential physician. He steps up and says he has a potent medicine that can cure him, but it will take time to prepare. But just as Philip is preparing this cure, a message arrives. A letter.
From Parmenio, his top general, with a warning.
A devastating warning. Parmenio writes that he has intelligence suggesting Philip the doctor has actually been bribed by Darius. The medicine he's preparing is poison.
So Alexander is lying there, deathly ill, and receives a note saying the one man offering to save him is actually trying to kill him on the orders of his most trusted general. What a nightmare scenario.
It's pure drama. What does he do? Alexander reads the note, folds it up, when Philip the doctor comes in with the cup of medicine. Alexander takes the cup in one hand, and with the other he hands Philip the warning letter from Parmenio.
While the doctor is reading this accusation of treason against him.
Alexander calmly drinks the entire bowl of medicine down.
Wow, that's an incredible gamble. Talk about trust, or maybe just fatalism.
It's debated. Green calls it touch and go. Was it supreme confidence in his doctor? A calculated test of loyalty? A bluff? Or was he maybe just too sick and feverish to care, figuring he was dying anyway? Whatever the motive, the effect was powerful. Philip the doctor was obviously horrified by the letter, but vindicated when Alexander recovered. It bound Philip to Alexander with unbreakable loyalty. It was a massive display of something. Trust, courage, desperation, maybe all three.
It worked anyway. He recovered. And then comes another iconic moment. Gordium.
Ah, the Gordian knot. Alexander arrives in Gordium in central Anatolia, and there's this ancient chariot tied to a post with this incredibly complex knot made of cornel bark. And there's an old prophecy and oracle saying that whoever can undo this knot will become the lord of all Asia.
A clear challenge, tailor-made for someone like Alexander.
Absolutely. He tries, he struggles with it. The sources say he was getting frustrated at a loss how to proceed. The knot was impossible to unpick.
So what did he do? The famous solution.
Characteristically direct. He apparently exclaimed something like, "What difference does it make how I loose it?" Drew his sword and just slashed straight through the whole tangled mess.
Cut the knot. Didn't untie it.
Cut it clean through. Now, Green is a bit skeptical, suggesting this neat story might be an ex post facto rationalization, something made up later to fit Alexander's image, making his impatience seem like cleverness. But whether it happened exactly like that or not, symbolically, it was perfect. Rule confirmed not by patient ingenuity, but by decisive, sharp force, cutting through the problem.
That reliance on force becomes much less symbolic and much more brutal in the next phase, doesn't it? The sieges?
Oh yes, the sieges of Tyre and Gaza in 332 BC are grim. Tyre was this island fortress city, seemingly impregnable. It defied him.
And Alexander's response was monumental engineering, building a causeway.
A massive mole, yes, a land bridge stretching half a mile out into the sea under constant attack from the Tyrian navy. It took 7 long, costly months. He eventually needed a fleet, gathered from other Phoenician cities that defected to him, to blockade Tyre and finally storm it.
And the aftermath, when Tyre finally fell.
Absolute brutality. Utter destruction. Green details it. 30,000 Tyrian citizens sold into slavery, and the surviving men of military age, about 2,000 of them. Crucified, nailed to crosses along the shoreline. A horrifying spectacle meant as a warning to every other city that might think of resisting him. Sheer terror as policy.
Gaza wasn't much better, was it? It held out for 2 months.
Yeah, the governor there, a man named Battus, described as a huge, corpulent, dark-skinned eunuch, put up a stubborn defense, and crucially refused to bow or beg for mercy when captured.
And this defiance, it pushed Alexander over the edge.
It seems so. Green recounts the most gruesome anecdote here, though admitting it might be later embellishment based on the Iliad. Allegedly, Alexander, completely losing control, perhaps enraged by Battus's defiance and maybe his appearance, had holes pierced through Battus's ankles while he was still alive.
Oh no.
Lashed him behind his chariot and dragged him around the walls of Gaza until he was dead. A grim variant, Green calls it, on Achilles' treatment of Hector's dead body.
Whether it happened exactly like that or not, the fact the story even existed points to a capacity for extreme, almost psychotic rage when his will was thwarted.
Exactly. It shows that beneath the brilliant general, there was this potential for archaic, brutal, personal vengeance, especially when faced with defiance.
Okay, so after that wave of, frankly, terrifying brutality, Alexander moves into Egypt, and there he seems to seek a different kind of validation.
Yes, a divine one. He enters Egypt, which doesn't put up a fight, and he's basically welcomed. He's solemnly instated as pharaoh in Memphis. He takes on the traditional pharaonic titles, Horus the Golden One, son of Ra, beloved of Amen. He becomes, in Egyptian eyes, a god king.
And he founds Alexandria.
Right. Chooses the spot on the coast for his most famous city. A strategic masterstroke, but also part of building his legend. But then he does something quite extraordinary and dangerous. He makes this long, difficult pilgrimage deep into the western desert.
To the oasis of Siwa, to consult the oracle of Zeus Ammon.
Exactly. Now, his stated public motive was basically to confirm his divine parentage. Was he really the son of Philip, or was he like the myths of heroes, actually the son of Zeus, identified with the Egyptian god Ammon?
Trying to legitimize his rule, perhaps, by claiming divinity.
That's part of it. But Green points out another much more chilling possible motive mentioned in some sources. Alexander also wanted to ask the oracle if all of his father's murderers had been punished yet.
Wait, why is that chilling?
Think about it. If Alexander was involved in Philip's assassination, even indirectly, asking a divine oracle if all the killers have been caught is deeply fraught. Is he seeking reassurance? Absolution. Trying to use the god to cover his tracks. Green sees it as a terrifying glimpse into Alexander's mindset. If he was complicit, this visit was partly about dealing with the huge psychological and maybe supernatural burden of parricide, trying to secure his divine status to escape earthly or even divine consequences.
Wow. That adds a whole other layer to the Siwa trip. Okay, he returns from the desert, presumably reassured by the oracle, and heads back towards Mesopotamia for the final showdown with Darius.
Gaugamela, 331 BC, the decisive battle. And Alexander gets a shock when he sees Darius's army. He'd expected something similar to the force he beat at Aetius earlier. But Darius had spent 2 years rebuilding, focusing on his strengths. Alexander saw, Green says, countless thousands of mailed horsemen, heavy cataphracts. Persian cavalry outnumbered the Macedonians maybe 5-1. Darius also had war chariots with scythes on the wheels, and even war elephants, though they didn't play much part.
So a much tougher proposition than anticipated.
Absolutely. But Alexander's tactical genius, particularly his use of the companion cavalry in a daring flanking maneuver, won the day. Darius fled the field, his army disintegrated. It was effectively the end of the Persian Empire as a fighting force.
And the aftermath shows Alexander's political savvy again.
Immediately. The Persian governor of Babylon, a powerful noble named Mazaeus, who had fought bravely at Gaugamela, surrendered the city without a fight. Alexander's response. He confirmed Mazaeus as satrap of Babylon, a particularly astute move, Green calls it. It showed the Persian aristocracy that resistance was futile, but cooperation would be rewarded. It helped stabilize this huge, wealthy province instantly.
Smart politics. But then comes the final scene with Darius himself.
Yeah, this is quite poignant. Darius fled eastwards, but he was eventually betrayed and overthrown by some of his own nobles, led by Bessus, the satrap of Bactria. When Alexander's advance guard finally caught up, they found Darius dying, or maybe just dead, in a wagon. He'd been stabbed by Bessus' men and left behind.
What were the circumstances like?
Green paints a grim picture based on the sources. Darius lay abandoned, maybe still in chains, javelins protruding from his body, covered in blood, alone except for a faithful dog guarding his corpse.
And Alexander's reaction when he arrived.
Complex. The sources say his distress was obvious and genuine. He supposedly covered the body with his own royal cloak, expressed anger at the betrayal, and later gave Darius a magnificent royal burial back in Persia at Persepolis.
Genuine grief for a fallen king. Or was it brilliant political theater?
Probably a bit of both. Green leans towards acknowledging some genuine respect, perhaps, but the political dimension was undeniable. By honoring Darius, Alexander positioned himself as the legitimate successor, the avenger of the rightful king against the usurper Bessus. It was absolutely necessary politically to win over the Persian establishment.
But winning over the Persians meant alienating his own Macedonians.
That's the fundamental tension from this point on. To rule the empire, he needed the cooperation of the Iranian nobility. That meant adopting some Persian customs, showing respect, appointing them to high office. But every step he took in that direction risked offending his Macedonian veterans, who saw it as their king going native, forgetting who won the empire for him. He also faced ideological opposition from people like the Magi, the Zoroastrian priests, who, according to some texts, saw Alexander and his Greeks as demonic invaders, the demons with disheveled hair.
This growing tension, this paranoia perhaps, seems to lead directly into one of the darkest episodes, the purge of Philotas and Parmenio.
Yes. This is a crucial turning point and a chilling practical lesson in the paranoia of absolute power. Parmenio, the old, experienced general who had helped him secure the throne, he was still out there, commanding in Media, holding the treasury at Ecbatana. And his son, Philotas, commanded the companion cavalry, the elite strike force. The Parmenio family and their network held almost every key command, Green notes. They were a massive power block within the state.
Too powerful for Alexander's comfort.
Exactly. Alexander started closing in. He apparently used Philotas' mistress, a woman named Antigone, to spy on him, encouraging her to report any loose talk or discontent Philotas expressed. But the actual evidence against Philotas was thin.
So how did Alexander make his move?
A conspiracy, real or perhaps fabricated, came to light. A soldier named Dimnus supposedly confessed to a plot against Alexander, implicating several others. This plot was reported to Philotas by another soldier, Sabellinus. Philotas fatally dismissed it. He maybe thought it was just gossip or a homosexual quarrel, as Green suggests some sources imply. Critically, he failed to report it immediately to Alexander for 2 days.
That delay was his doom.
It gave Alexander the pretext he needed. He accused Philotas not necessarily of joining the plot, but of misprision of knowing about it and deliberately concealing it, which was treason. Philotas was arrested. A trial was held before the Macedonian Army Assembly. Alexander himself prosecuted the case vehemently.
Was it a fair trial?
Not remotely. It was pure political theater. Alexander needed a confession that implicated the real target, Parmenio. So Philotas was tortured, viciously. The torture was overseen by Alexander's closest confidants, Craterus, Hephaestion, and Coinus, who is actually Philotas's brother-in-law, adding another layer of grimness. Under torture, Philotas confessed and, crucially, implicated his father, Parmenio, perhaps falsely.
And once Alexander had that confession,
he moved with terrifying speed. He dispatched a trusted officer, Polydamas, on racing camels across the desert to Ecbatana, carrying the death warrant for Parmenio. An incredibly fast, grueling ride to prevent Parmenio hearing the news and reacting. Polydamas arrived, delivered the warrant to Cleander and other officers loyal to Alexander, who were already stationed with Parmenio. They found the old general walking in the royal park at Ecbatana and murdered him on the spot. Stabbed him repeatedly.
just like that. No trial, no warning.
None. His head was cut off and sent back to Alexander as proof the deed was done.
It's shocking. Was there any real evidence Parmenio was plotting?
Green emphasizes the whole affair remains tantalizingly ambiguous. We'll likely never know for sure if Philotas or Parmenio were genuinely treasonous. But Green's analysis focuses on the political reality. Whether they were guilty or not, the Parmenio clique represented an alternative power base, rooted in the old Macedonian aristocracy that Alexander, aspiring to absolute, centralized, almost Oriental-style monarchy, could not tolerate. The purge was an act of political absolutism, eliminating potential rivals and sending a chilling message to everyone else. A dark lesson in how paranoia and the need for total control can operate at the highest levels.
So with Parmenio and Philotas gone, the old guard is effectively broken, and Alexander accelerates his policy of, well, Orientalization.
Yes, adopting Persian customs becomes more overt. He starts wearing elements of Persian royal dress, the blue and white diadem, the white robe and sash. Though Green notes he drew the line at wearing trousers, which Macedonians considered barbaric. He also took over Darius's traditional retinue of 365 concubines, one for each day of the year. Although Green adds, rather amusingly, that Alexander seems to have found this arrangement rather boring and didn't make much use of it.
What was the motive here? Was he genuinely attracted to Persian culture?
Green argues it was primarily political necessity. To be accepted by the Persians and Iranians as their legitimate great king, not just a foreign conqueror, he had to adopt some of their symbols of kingship. But the risk, the huge risk, was alienating his own Macedonians. They saw their king adopting the dress and habits of the people they had just conquered. It bred deep resentment, what Green calls bitter and implacable hatred among some factions.
And that resentment boils over spectacularly in 328 BC, the murder of Clitus.
Yeah, this is another incredibly dark moment. It happens at a lavish banquet in Marikonda, modern Samarkand. Things get out of hand, as they often did with Macedonian drinking parties. Lots of wine. Alexander, probably half drunk himself, starts boasting about his own achievements, maybe letting sycophants compare him favorably to the demigod Heracles, one of his supposed ancestors.
And Clitus isn't having it. This is Black Clitus, the man who saved Alexander's life at the Granicus.
The very same man. Clitus, also drunk and probably simmering with resentment about the pro-Persian policies and the deaths of Parmenio and Philotas, speaks up. He starts defending Philip II, Alexander's father, saying Philip's achievements were greater. He defends Parmenio. He maybe accuses Alexander of disowning his father Philip and falsely claiming the god Ammon as his father. He's basically attacking Alexander's legitimacy and achievements to his face in front of everyone.
Incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, given Alexander's temper.
Both. Probably. Alexander flies into a rage. He calls for his guards. People try to restrain Clitus, try to get him out of the room. Alexander screams for a spear. In the chaos, Alexander manages to grab a spear or javelin from a guard, finds Clitus, who maybe came back into the room or shouted something else, and runs him through, kills him on the spot.
Just like that. He killed the man who saved his life.
Instantly. And their regret, according to the sources, was immediate and overwhelming. Alexander apparently threw himself onto Clytus's body, weeping, calling him by name, refusing food or drink for days, withdrawing completely. He seemed genuinely horrified by what he'd done in his drunken fury.
But the aftermath, that's where it gets really chilling politically.
Yes. How does the army, the command structure, handle the fact that the king just murdered one of his most respected officers and saviors in a drunken rage? The solution was a masterclass in political fixing. The Macedonian army assembly was convened, and they formally decreed that Clytus had been justly put to death for treason because he had insulted the king.
They blamed the victim.
They blamed the victim. And then they shifted the ultimate blame onto the gods, specifically Dionysus, the god of wine, whose anger must have clouded the king's judgment. It was fate, not the king's fault. Green marks this as a point of no return, the end of freedom within the army's high command. Murder, driven by the king's personal failings, was now publicly justified by decree. You couldn't criticize the king, even when he was clearly in the wrong.
That failure to tolerate dissent, or even just differing opinions, continued with his next major cultural initiative, didn't it?
Yes, the attempt to introduce proskynesis. This was the Persian court ritual of bowing or prostrating oneself before the great king. It implied acknowledging the king's divine or semi-divine status.
And Alexander wanted his Macedonians and Greeks to do this.
He tried to introduce it, probably at a banquet, as a way to unify court ceremony between Macedonians and Persians. Big mistake.
Why? What happened?
The Macedonians were horrified. They saw it as blasphemous, treating a mortal king like a god, and as a degrading, slavish Oriental custom. The Greeks felt similarly. There was apparently a public debate, or at least strong resistance, led by the court historian and philosopher Callisthenes, who happened to be Aristotle's nephew.
Callisthenes argued against it publicly.
He did, making the intellectual case against treating Alexander as a god. And crucially, he had the backing of many senior Macedonian commanders who also opposed it. Alexander had seriously misread the room.
So proskynesis failed.
It failed. Alexander had to back down. But Callisthenes, by leading the successful opposition, had made a fatal enemy. Green says Callisthenes, in winning this argument, essentially dug his own grave. Alexander wouldn't forgive that public humiliation. He'd find a way to get rid of Callisthenes later, implicating him, probably falsely, in another conspiracy.
It shows Alexander's growing inability to handle anything less than total obedience. He's pushing further east now, into India. What's driving him at this point?
Green uses the Greek word pothos, this burning desire, this yearning, almost an irrational longing. It wasn't just about strategic goals anymore. It was partly sheer curiosity to see the edges of the world, to reach ocean, the great river believed to encircle the earth. But it was also about surpassing legendary figures, his supposed ancestors like Dionysus and Heracles, who were said to have campaigned in India. He needed to go further, achieve more than anyone, real or mythical.
It is men. They didn't share this pothos, did they?
Not anymore. They had marched thousands upon thousands of miles, over 17,000 by this point, Green estimates. They had fought countless battles, endured incredible hardships, conquered the Persian Empire. They were exhausted, homesick, wounded. When they reached the Hyphasis River, the modern Beas in India, which marked the easternmost extent of Darius the Surus' old Persian Empire, they balked.
That's the famous Hyphasis mutiny.
Yes. Alexander wanted to push on further into the unknown lands beyond the river, maybe towards the Ganges. He believed ocean was just beyond. His men refused, flat out refused to go any further. They had reached their limit. Crossing the Hyphasis meant marching literally to the world's end, as far as they were concerned.
How did Alexander handle this open defiance from his entire army?
First, he tried sulking. He withdrew into his tent for 3 days, hoping shame or loyalty would make them change their minds. A kind of passive-aggressive tactic. It didn't work. They held firm. Coenus, one of his senior commanders, and the guy who helped torture Philotas, acted as the army's spokesman, pleading their case. Finally, Alexander had to relent. He agreed to turn back.
A rare defeat for Alexander's will.
A huge defeat. And Green suggests he never forgave them for it. Although he put on a show of agreeing, Green argues Alexander was privately furious and determined, by whatever means, to make the long homeward trek a hell on earth for them all.
Which leads to the disastrous return journey.
Exactly. Instead of taking a known, safer route back, Alexander made a fateful decision. He decided to split his forces. Part went by sea, down the Indus and along the coast. But he led the main column, tens of thousands of soldiers and followers, overland. And he chose to march them through the Gadrosian Desert, the Makran Desert in modern Pakistan and Iran. one of the most desolate, arid, inhospitable places on Earth.
Why on earth would he do that?
Partly, Green suggests, out of that same pathos, a desire to achieve what legendary figures like Queen Semiramis and Cyrus the Great had supposedly failed to do, to conquer this desert. And partly, perhaps, out of spite, a way to punish the army for the mutiny.
And the march was a catastrophe.
An unmitigated disaster, far worse than Alexander anticipated. Wagons couldn't move in the soft sands, supplies ran out, water was incredibly scarce, flash floods and dry riverbeds drowned people. Men became desperate, secretly killing the pack animals just to eat, destroying the army's baggage train. The losses were appalling. Green compares the scale of the suffering and death toll to Napoleon's retreat from Moscow in 1812. Of the perhaps 85,000 people who started that desert march, estimates suggest maybe only 25,000 survived. His elite companion cavalry was reduced from around 1,700 to maybe 1,000.
A self-inflicted wound on his own army, born out of pride and maybe anger.
A catastrophic leadership failure, driven by that wounded pride and relentless pathos that nearly destroyed his army.
Okay, so Alexander finally makes it back from India, having endured the horrors of the Gadrosian Desert. How does he reassert control?
He returns coldly furious, Green says, and he immediately launches a series of political purges against the administrator, the satraps, and officials he had left behind years earlier. Many were accused, probably rightly in some cases, of corruption, extortion, mismanagement, ruling like petty kings in his absence. There were executions, like Orsines at Persepolis and the governor of Susiana. He needed scapegoats for the supply failures during the Gadrosian March, too.
Was this a genuine crackdown on corruption? A necessary administrative cleanup?
Green is skeptical. He sees it as cynical and selective, confirming Alexander's basic indifference to good governance unless it served his immediate needs. While some corrupt officials were indeed executed, others who were known to be corrupt but remain loyal and, crucially, efficient at extracting resources, like Cleomenes in Egypt, who had a terrible reputation for graft but kept the money flowing, were actually confirmed in their commands.
So loyalty and usefulness trumped honesty.
Pretty much, especially if they weren't powerful Macedonians who might challenge him. It was about consolidating his personal power, not reforming the empire.
He also makes another major attempt at integration, doesn't he? The Susa mass marriages.
Yes, in 324 BC. This was a spectacular event. Alexander himself married 2 Persian princesses, Datara, Darius's daughter, and Parysatis. And he then basically forced about 80 to 100 of his senior Macedonian companions to simultaneously marry daughters of the Iranian nobility. He provided dowries, made it a huge celebration. The idea was clear: to physically merge the Macedonian and Persian ruling classes, create a new, unified elite for the empire.
A grand political vision. Did it work?
Complete failure. The Macedonians hated it. They saw it as being forced into these foreign marriages, another step towards what they considered Oriental despotism, abandoning their own customs. Green notes that almost all of these enforced marriages were simply repudiated soon after his death. The companions divorced their Persian wives almost immediately. Alexander's vision of a mixed elite crashed against the rocks of Macedonian prejudice and political reality.
His isolation seems to be growing.
Good
And his
actually.
parrot, well, his megalomania.
Definitely. Around this time, he sends envoys to the Greek cities of the League of Corinth with an extraordinary demand: that they should pass decrees officially recognizing him as a god.
Not just son of a god anymore, but an actual god himself.
Yes, deification while still alive. Now, some historians try to argue this was just a mere political device, a way to secure his authority or legal status in the Greek world, but Green strongly dismisses that. Why? Because demanding deification was strategically stupid. It gained him little politically and massively alienated both his Macedonian troops, who refused to worship their king, and many Persians, who had their own complex religious views.
So if it wasn't purely political, what was the driver?
Green puts it down to Alexander's psychology. He argues that Alexander's control over his own latent megalomania had grown progressively weaker, especially after the shocks of the mutiny and the Gadrosian disaster. He needed absolute validation. Green suggests he became a god in his own mind when he ceased wholly to trust his powers as a man. It was a sign of profound psychological crisis, not shrewd politics.
There's that great quote from the Spartan envoy, Damis, isn't there? When the demand for deification reached Sparta.
Perfect Spartan laconic wit. Damis apparently just said, "Since Alexander desires to be a god, let him be a god." A brilliant combination of outward compliance and utter contemptuous dismissal.
This period also sees another devastating personal blow for Alexander.
Yes, the death of Hephaestion in Ecbatana, also in 324 BC. Hephaestion was his closest friend, his confidant, possibly his lover since childhood, his paten, as some say. Hephaestion fell ill, seemed to recover, but then allegedly ignored doctor's orders, wolfed down a whole boiled chicken, and drank nearly half a gallon of chilled wine. He relapsed and died suddenly.
A fatal overindulgence, maybe, and Alexander's reaction.
It was extreme, monumental grief, underlining his complete emotional isolation now. He reportedly lay weeping over Hephaestion's body for a whole day and night. He ordered public mourning across the empire. He cut his own hair short, like Achilles mourning Patroclus. He even ordered the manes and tails of the army's horses to be shorn.
And the physician?
Crucified. Alexander had the unfortunate physician crucified for failing to save Hephaestion. He also, in a fit of rage, supposedly ordered the local temple of Asclepius, the god of healing, to be razed to the ground. And the funeral pyre he commissioned for Hephaestion back in Babylon was legendary in its extravagance, costing an unbelievable 10,000 or even 12,000 talents. This level of violent grief and spending, it just showed a man completely unbound by normal human limits anymore.
Which brings us, finally, to the end. Babylon, June 323 BC. The death of Alexander himself.
Yes. The end came relatively quickly. After overseeing preparations for Hephaestion's massive funeral pyre and planning a new expedition around Arabia, Alexander attended a series of drinking parties. After one particularly heavy session at the house of his friend Medius, he developed a fever. It worsened over several days. He lost the ability to speak.
And the final scene.
Poignant. Knowing the end was near, the ordinary Macedonian soldiers, his veterans, demanded to see him one last time. They filed past his sickbed in silence. Alexander, unable to speak, could only acknowledge them with his eyes, perhaps a slight movement of his hand. They were witnessing the mortality of the man they had followed to the end of the world. Shortly before losing consciousness, he supposedly passed his signet ring, the symbol of royal authority, to Perdiccas, the most senior marshal present. Then he died.
But the cause of death? It's never been definitively settled, has it? Fever, malaria, typhoid are possibilities.
Yeah.
But there's always been the shadow of poison.
Always. And Green investigates this thoroughly. The ancient source tradition, particularly the later Roman-era accounts, explicitly claims he was poisoned. There's a very specific, elaborate conspiracy theory laid out that the philosopher Aristotle, who had reason to hate Alexander after Callisthenes' death, prepared an undetectable, deadly poison from water that supposedly dripped from the river Styx in Arcadia.
Aristotle prepared it.
So the story goes. Then Antipater, the regent Alexander had left in charge of Macedon back home, and whom Alexander had recently summoned to Babylon, a summons Antipater likely feared was for his own execution, arranged for the poison to be delivered. Antipater's son, Cassander, supposedly brought it to Babylon concealed in a mule's hoof, and then another of Antipater's sons, Iollas, who was Alexander's royal cupbearer, administered the poison to Alexander in a cup of strong, unmixed wine during that final party.
Wow. That's incredibly detailed. Is it plausible?
It's almost too detailed, which makes historians suspicious. Green suggests this specific story, blaming Aristotle and Antipater's family, might well have been later propaganda put out by Alexander's murderers. Maybe Perdiccas' faction trying to frame the rival Antipater faction in the power struggles that immediately followed Alexander's death. However, Green concludes that while the specifics are doubtful, a smoothly executed coup d'etat involving numerous conspirators is actually highly probable.
So poison is still very much on the table.
Very much so. Think about the context. Alexander was increasingly paranoid, purging rivals. He had summoned Antipater, the most powerful man left in Europe, to Babylon, likely intending to remove him. Antipater knew this. He had motive, means, and opportunity to strike first. A preemptive assassination, masked by illness after a drinking binge, makes a lot of cold, hard political sense in that ruthless world. We'll probably never know for sure, but Green leaves the door wide open for poison. Hashtag outro required closing and challenge.
What a journey. Peter Green's biography really does strip away the romantic varnish, doesn't it? We're left with this incredibly complex, contradictory figure, brilliant general, near-immortal commander, yes, but also capable of appalling brutality, ruthlessly indifferent to stable administration, driven by that dangerous pathos, that burning desire, often to the exclusion of prudence, loyalty, or even basic human connection.
Absolutely. And the ultimate lesson here for you, the listener, isn't just about understanding ancient history. It's about understanding the timeless dynamics of power, ambition, and and leadership, especially under extreme pressure. So the challenge from this deep dive is maybe to examine your own life. Where might your own ambitions be fueled by that kind of pathos, that perhaps irrational desire to push beyond limits? Or where might paranoia cloud judgment in high-stakes situations?
Yeah, how can Green's insights highlighting the political necessity, sometimes lurking behind the terror, or the immense psychological cost of absolute power, how can that sharpen your own political and strategic judgment, even in everyday life?
It forces you to think critically about motivation, consequence, and the stories leaders tell about themselves.
We definitely invite you to continue this discussion. Share your thoughts on Peter Green's book on Alexander's incredibly complex legacy. What was the most shocking anecdote for you? Was it the 18 tons of incense, the dragging of Bacchus, the crucifixion of the doctor? Share your insights maybe on social media. Engage with these ideas.
And to really grapple with the full force of Green's critical analysis, his deep dive into the sources, we strongly encourage you to get the book itself, Alexander of Macedon 356-323 BC by Peter Green. It's an exhaustive and, I think, definitive work.
It truly is. Thank you so much for joining us for this special Playing Books podcast. Please follow, subscribe, and share this podcast with others who seek knowledge and insight.